Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Caitlin Saladino. I'm the Director of Strategic Development here at Brookings Mountain West. On behalf of my colleagues, Bill Brown, Ashley LeClaire, our Executive Director, Dave Demore, our colleagues at the Lindsay Institute, and our student worker team, I want to thank you for coming out tonight for our second talk in the Brookings Scholar Lecture Series here in the spring semester of 2024. I also want to take a brief moment to acknowledge our donors, without whose support we would not be able to do the events that we do, like this one tonight, and I want to thank them for that. As well, I'll take a minute to thank our team with UNLV TV, who is, of course, helping us record this. This will be available up on our website in just a few days, and of course, the slides that you'll see Erin present tonight will also be available, so don't worry about scribbling frantically everything that you hear. It will be available, easily accessible very, very soon. All of our talks, of course, are also on our YouTube page. We recorded 125 of these so far, so we're happy to add this talk tonight to the queue. This week, of course, we've also had the great pleasure of welcoming back our friend and colleague, Aaron Klein, to Brookings Mountain West. Just a little bit of history. The last time Aaron was out, he was here literally the 3 days before we shut down for the pandemic and went into lockdown. So we're really, really happy to have him here 4 years later, almost to the day, back at Brookings Mountain West. And like all our visiting scholars, Aaron's been really busy this week meeting with our community here at UNLV and within the Las Vegas community as well, teaching classes, hosting workshops with student groups, meeting with our university administration tomorrow, and various stakeholders, so we're just delighted to have him here. Before I turn things over to him, I'll give you a little bit about his bio, and then we'll kick things off. Aaron Klein is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on financial technology and regulation, payments, macroeconomics, and infrastructure finance and policy. Prior to joining Brookings in 2016, he directed the Bipartisan Policy Center's Financial Regulatory Reform Initiative, and Aaron previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. He worked on financial regulatory reform issues, including crafting and helping secure passage of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. And Aaron is a graduate of Dartmouth College and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He also will be taking some questions throughout today, so if you have questions and would like to speak up, by all means, feel free to do that. I'll try and race around with the microphone as quickly as I can to capture you for our recording. And of course, if you have any other questions at the end of the talk, save those and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So without further ado, will you help me in joining and welcoming Aaron Klein?
Thank you very much, Caitlin. It's fantastic to be back. When I leave, I expect to close the city again. It's wonderful to be back. It's so enlightening. I've had such a great time here. I've learned so much, and I continue to learn. I'm looking forward to this conversation being a two-way street. So please, in any process, raise a hand, ask a question, take a deviation. Some of this stuff is kind of weird and it can get you in strange places. That's what I found as I've journeyed down America's payment system. And it has taken me really, really weird places. And as a result, I'm here today with a couple goals. One, I want everybody to leave understanding more deeply and fundamentally what money is, how payment systems operate, why they're important. This will set the stage for why we have started using them, not to maximize economic growth, but as a tool of domestic and international policy. And what this trend means if it continues to move forward without critical analysis and more thought about what the costs and benefits are of using this foreign policy payments lever. What do I mean by this? Well, we're gonna see that in a second, but the first thing I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm banned by Russia. Thank you very much. It was the first line in my performance review when Brookings asked what I did last year that justified my position. I said I ticked off somebody. In fact, I was banned by Russia for this work. If you think about it, what happened? Russia invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine, and America and our allies in Europe and all over the world responded by kicking them out of the international banking system, by restricting their access to the flow of payments. That's how important payments has become as a tool of policy. It is our first and most bold response to the invasion of a sovereign nation by another. So, what did Russia do, if you don't believe me? So Russia banned 500 people. Here I am, right there. That's my name in Cyrillic. And in Cyrillic, this list is alphabetized by Cyrillic, and so you can find up here Jimmy Kimmel, and down here, Stephen Colbert. And it's the first time I'm put in between them because the hard C and the K sound the same in Cyrillic and are done. Why did Russia react so badly to this? Why is this such a massive deal? And why did the United States do this? And not just with Russian payments. This is not out of nowhere. We've been increasingly using this payment system to project policy, both at home and abroad. And so what I want to talk about here is set some definitional groundwork. We use the words a lot, and we all assume what they mean. What is money? Everybody here uses money. It is ingrained in our society. I tend to think economics is a very bad job of teaching money. If your students were here and you went through, to the extent you even got a definition of money, which is often not clearly defined in all textbooks, you probably got the John Locke 17th century definition, which is money is a medium of exchange. John Locke was a great philosopher, not such a good economist. A medium of exchange, anything can be a medium of exchange, right? Caitlin and I can take each other out for lunch. That's a medium of exchange. It's a form of friendship. I owe Caitlin lunch. That's an asset on her balance sheet. It's a liability on mine. But it's not money. Why is it not money? Because if Caitlin owes someone else lunch, she can't tell me to go take that person out to lunch. Money is better thought of, and this comes from Felix Martin's book, so I'll give him the citation he deserves, Money, an Unauthorized Biography, great book. Money is a system of debits and credits that requires third-party acceptance without prior party consent. If you have frequent flyer miles, they're worth something, but you can't give them to me without the airline agreeing to transfer them between the account, often with a fee, right? We could use any system of debits and credits that have that type of tradability and acceptance. And this is very different than a medium of exchange. There are lots of mediums of exchange that don't qualify. What makes you money, money is special. Money can be accepted without prior party consent. That usually requires, and historically has required, the government to create and issue the money. Because the only reason I know the money is good is the government stands behind it. We also have private money. Banks create money, right? But the government stands behind the banks. They're chartered, they're regulated, they're insured, et cetera. We'll talk about crypto and we'll talk about some alternative new concepts. But are we all clear on what the definition of money that I'm using in this talk is? System of debits and credits, third-party acceptance without prior party consent. Now, you can't have money without a payment system. You have to have a system of debits and credits, the ability to track, and you have to have a way to move it across parties without prior party consent. So money itself as a concept requires a payment system behind it. So payments is an integral form to even exist for something to get the property of money.
What do you mean when you say without prior party?
Right. So I want to give you my United Airlines frequent flyer miles. United has to agree to transfer it between our accounts. Caitlin wants to give the lunch I owe her to Bill, right? No, right? But if I give you money, it's yours. It doesn't matter how I got it or where I got it from. When you get money, whether it's a bearer instrument like physical cash or it's a deposit in your account, it's yours. Nobody else needs to consent. It doesn't matter where the money came from. It's yours now. And that's the distinction of the prior party consent that makes a distinction between an asset, right? Because this idea that it's just a medium of exchange, we can exchange anything. Right? We can exchange Pokemon cards. We can assign them values, a system of debits and credits. Right? But there has to be, the question is does it require another entity to sign off on the transfer? Because then it's not money, then it's that person's, whoever's signing off on the transfer, it's their system of debits and credits. It's not broadly accepted. Does that make sense? So, couple things about payment system. Got to have one to make money. Money doesn't exist without this, and it's often generally through the banking system. Two, the payment system is denominated in the currency that's used. You can have payment systems that mix currency, right? But if you have a dollar-based transaction, then you have to have dollars behind it. If you have a euro-based system, you have euros behind it, right? Two, payments are increasingly electronic. The pandemic changed retail transactions, the ability to get online banking and other things. Money is really just ones and zeros. It's numbers and accounts. It's data on a spreadsheet. If anybody thinks that a bank has a little vault with your name on it and a bunch of cash with yours, no. All you have is a line item in a spreadsheet there, right? And so these kind of elements of what are the payment system become important when you realize the power the payment system has to shape anything that touches money, which is basically kind of almost everything, in a way. So, what is a payment? This is something that a lot of people don't fully understand. A payment is two distinct concepts: the flow of money, the actual movement, and the flow of information. In fact, when we talked about Russia being kicked off of a global payment system called SWIFT, SWIFT doesn't move a penny. SWIFT is a messaging system that provides the information, not the flow of money. The money goes through the banks. But a payment system requires both of these instruments, the actual movement of funds and the flow of information. So let's do an example here, right? So I'm going to pick you getting paid. And right, who's the third party in this? The payroll processor. Right? I picked the largest one, but you could imagine, right? I don't know who the university uses. Brookings happens to use ADP, right? So first, my employer sends the money to the payroll agency. The payroll agency sends it to me. That's the flow, that's the payment every 2 weeks when I get my direct deposit. 3 steps. They send it on Tuesday, ADP gets it, I get it on Friday. At the same time, there's a parallel flow of information. They say, Brookings, ADP. They have to tell ADP, Aaron Klein, this is how much he's getting paid this week. This is his bank. This is the day of his paycheck, right? These are his withholdings. This information, right, then has to flow through. You cannot, and the information and the money don't have to go at the same time. They're not inherently connected. They can go on different networks like SWIFT and the central banks. They're two totally separable pieces, but they're both integral. And both of which provide a moment for policymakers to stop either flow. You could stop the flow of the money. You could get, and you can do it by leveraging the information. You can stop the flow of the information, or you can take the flow of the information. Isn't it interesting that these people are getting paid? Anybody follow the breaking news in the last 2 hours about Otani? Am I breaking news here, right? Breaking news. Otani, $4.5 million in gambling debts. Paid, there have been conflicting reports about whether his interpreter was paying it out of his bank account, or he was paying it to settle a debt from his interpreter. Right? How did this all come to be? Well, this illegal sports bookie was arrested in California, and they found who'd been wiring money to him. Which bank account? It wasn't the interpreter's account, right? And so this type of flow of information is critically important and valuable. It is not just the flow of funds. So, why do we have a payment system? Well, we have a payment system predominantly for economic growth. Historically, the concept was, we're going to build a payment system to maximize the economic growth. But there are policy consequences. Some types of activity are legal, some types of activity are illegal, some types of activity the government just wants to know more about. There was an unstated but long-held belief that what you had was a system where the primary purpose was economic, and to the extent law enforcement or government wanted information, the payment system had to keep records and had to make those records available. and depending on what type of transactions were being noticed, had to even proactively send the information. Hey guys, there's something called a suspicious activity report. Hey, there's a currency transaction report. A dollar threshold set in 1970 at $10,000. You could have paid your entire annual tuition at UNLV in cash and not triggered it. Nowadays, I don't want to ask that question. I can tell you it would be a lot more. So but all those were just reports. All the bank has to do, even here, Bank of Cannabis Company, you have to file a lot of reports, but that's it, just reports. You can do it if you want. You can bank them not, yes, no. What's happening is we're changing this, and we're changing this in a profound way in which policymakers have discovered that they can stop activity they don't like through the payment system. So let me give you an example. I was working in the United States Senate in 2001 to 2005, and online poker boomed. This thing, ESPN, World Series of Poker, right? $82 million, $2.4 billion. It felt like every TV ad, poker stars on, people were all playing, two-tabling, three-tabling, right? We weren't using phones. For the kids in the room, this is before the iPhone. So there wasn't internet before there were smartphones, trust me. And Congress got mad about this. And Congress decided to stop it. And they decided to stop it in a novel way. They said the banks have to find the payment system, the online poker, and not transact any money to them, both domestically or abroad. Here's a list of anybody operating a poker company. You can't send them the money. So the people in charge of doing this ban, which passed, wildly popular in both chambers, and it still exists today. Even though today in my state of Maryland, I can bet on almost any sporting event on my phone, I can't play cards. Society had this moment in time where gambling was viewed very differently than gaming is viewed today, particularly on wagering, and they had this reaction, and it stays on the books. And it's wildly, I mean, I can't understand why one form of gaming is so much different than another. But what I really can't understand is before, for any other activity, the bank could wire the money other than to a list of banned foreign entities for sanctions or other bad actors. There have been actors who've been banned and kicked off. But this is just, we don't like this, right? Tons of other illicit activity, right? And it's not even clear online poker was illicit when it was blowing up. What law were they really violating, right? Game of skill versus game of chance. But Congress said, we're just going to shut this thing down by pulling on the money lever, on the payments lever. Still stands today. Now, this is the question I came to. Is the purpose of the payment system to provide a lever for society to implement a policy set of choices? Or is the purpose to allow commerce and activity, and if the government wants to shut down commerce and activity in a certain ring, then pass a law saying we can't do this, and get information from the flow of funds if you want to go after the bad actors, if you want to catch the bad people? Or is the purpose to proactively prohibit certain actions, in which case then the payment system has to restructure that flow of information and flow of money in order to comport with the law? We can't flow money here. You're on the banned list. We're checking all these different activities. Very, very different structure of the financial system. All right, let me give you some examples. Every few years, Congress will pass tougher sanctions on a country. Went back and looked at this at Cuba and Iran, Russia. And how do you keep getting tougher? Well, you keep going after the money. You restrict their banks. You restrict their ability. You kick them off of SWIFT, off of global banking, right? Same thing domestically, online poker. I don't know if anybody followed the stories about Backpages and Nick Kristof in the New York Times, and there was a whole push to essentially get Visa and MasterCard to stop payment processing for companies that were engaged in either, depending on who you want to talk about it, voluntary sex work, human trafficking, illegal sexual activity for money. Depending on what your definitions are, that activity was never publicly challenged in court. Nobody was sent to jail on this. But Visa and MasterCard got pressured and sued by people who said they'd been victims for facilitating the payment in this situation and then dropped. And we're seeing this in cannabis, where financial institutions are being required to do so many things on payments. The Federal Reserve of Kansas City, you guys here are lucky. The San Francisco Fed has taken a very different view on cannabis banking, but the Federal Reserve of Kansas City refused to give access to the payment system to a credit union in Kansas City that was chartered, in Denver, that was chartered by the state legislature to bank cannabis. And the Kansas City Federal Reserve said, no, we're not going to let you have what's called a master account, which is a gatekeeping mechanism to access America's payment system. Even though plenty of banks and credit unions handle cannabis, Kansas City Fed didn't like this one, and they use that. I put abortion and guns. That's not there yet, but it's being debated. There's been pressure on Visa and MasterCard to do what are called merchant codes for gun purchases to allow law enforcement to track stores that are selling more guns or potentially people who are on lists. You know, a different way to do in the background checks would be to look at whose cards and things were being used to process. Andrew Ross Sorkin of the New York Times and CNBC has been very out there arguing that the payment system needs to proactively implement gun control. You know, I think our gun control policies are really bad. I'm also probably in a pretty traditional place with Democrats on both gun control and abortion. But the same people on the left that want to use a payment system to regulate access to guns, well, a different group of people on the right want to use it to regulate access to abortion. If you're in Texas and you go somewhere out of state, they want to be able to track you by your money. Look at the codes from abortion clinics. Prosecute you in state laws for having left to do these things. This is what I mean about there's a bit of a Pandora's box. That every time you use this for something, whether you're for or against the activity, think about the precedent that we're setting without having thought about those trade-offs. So I'm going to turn and get a little more specific about Russia. Before I do that, I want to pause and see if anybody has any questions. Okay. So Russia is a huge moment, a seminal moment in the use of payments for policy, right? Wildly popular in here, where people did not want to send American troops on the ground to combat. We're having a difficult time in Congress funding Ukraine's own resistance, even though it's purchasing mostly American-made military equipment. But it was pretty popular to do economic sanctions. And the sanctions focused on not allowing Russia to access the global payment system, particularly in the US, anything involving dollars, but really in a coordinated effort to cut out Russian banks from SWIFT, from all other forms of global payment settlement. This isolates them because the Western payment system, particularly the dollar system, since so many things are denominated in dollars, buy a barrel of oil, you're usually buying it in dollars, right? You're not buying it in rubles or in Chinese renminbi yet. We're going to turn to alternatives. But because things move through dollars, if Morocco buys something from Brazil, they're usually buying it from each other in dollars. And then in order to settle in dollars, there's only one place on earth that makes dollars, America. And you need to get into an American bank, into an American payment system. You need to exchange your real in Brazil and get the dollars, or you got to get the dollars and exchange it back. But the U.S. has a unique ability to project its global power by cutting off access to dollar-denominated payment settlement systems. And that's great when it's a good idea. And let me be crystal clear to all the Russians who know I've said this before to them. This was the right thing to do in this case. They invaded a sovereign nation without provocation. But have we explained to the world what our threshold is for kicking you out of the global payment system? Is it a case-by-case analysis? Does it depend on who the president is and what the president's view of Russia is? What is our policy on this? When do we do this? When do we not do this? How long does Cuba get access? How long did Iran have access for? What were their specific actions? There are plenty of other regimes that we may or may not be friendly with. What triggers this threshold line? Unclear. So, without that defined point of foreign policy, right, we have left ourselves in a situation where we're going to start building more and more pressure for alternative payment systems to get around us if we're going to be using this lever more frequently and in a not clear way. So I want to talk for a little bit about alternative systems that are starting to pop up. And the first one is crypto. Crypto is big. This is stable coins. I use stable coins. Those are cryptocurrencies that are dollar denominated. In fact, you see USDC coin, right? It's supposed to US dollar coin. That's in crypto company circle, right? Like that's its name, 1-to-1. These are meant to be at $1 of value, but they're crypto. And so they come with all the different, they have certain abilities to get around the existing payment system. And they're taking off. And the idea is, well, we don't want to settle in Bitcoin. The price of Bitcoin fluctuates a lot. How many Bitcoin am I going to pay you? And this or that. How do I know your Bitcoin is real? Or blah, blah, blah. Here in the stable coins, you know exactly what they're worth. They're trying to see a market in that type of payment. Taking off. Is crypto there yet? No, probably not. You'll point out one of the reasons crypto is heavily used in ransomware is precisely because it gets around all those other payment restrictions. If I ransomware you and I say, oh, send this to this bank account, the first thing they're going to do is get to that bank account and figure out whose it is and where it's going and which bank person opened that account, right? Here you have a totally different world. So the more we pressure the existing payment system for policy purposes, the more the other side says, well, maybe there's this other thing. The other thing is China. China's building their own global payment system that doesn't touch US dollars, that goes through the Chinese currency renminbi. It's called CIPS, C-I-P-S. And I don't know why the C is soft. Maybe in Cyrillic they want it to be as far away from me and Colbert and Kimmel and the other troublemakers as they could. And China is starting to get some attention. People are starting to use it. And people who aren't using it are just opening an account just in case. Do a little testing, right? You can't just like switch a payment system willy-nilly, right? You can't be like, oh, America did this thing, so Tuesday we're sending everything through something else, right? Anybody who's run a big organization and tried to change your payroll processor, right? You just can't do that overnight. But over time, China can go around and market it. Saudi Arabia, you're all friends with America now, but who knows, down the road, you may want to sell your oil to some people America doesn't want you to sell your oil to. And Venezuela, Chile, why don't you just try our system? It's always good to have a redundant, it's always good to have a backup. Now, the renminbi currency is actively pegged and monitored by the Chinese, some would say manipulated. So they have some stability. There's some concerns about expropriation. How much money do you want to leave in China? Usually to run a payment system, you have to be leaving large balances, right? You're not taking everything out, taking everything in. And there's rule of law, and there are reasons to believe that people don't want to do it overnight. But if people are unclear as to what it would be that would trigger America to use the payment system potentially against them and their nation, then there becomes, I think, over time, increasing pressure for some other country to operate a different payment system, just in case. And again, payments, just to be very clear, they run on something that economists like to call network externalities. The more people on the system, the more valuable the system is. It's agglomerative. It's actually the opposite of most economics, right, is the more there is of something, the less valuable it is. Right? Economics is based on the principle of scarcity, and the less scarce something is, the less valuable it is. That's demonstrably false. Kate Judge, in her great book, Direct, from Columbia, points out the single most important resource in the entire world is infinite. It's love. So this idea of marginal diminishing marginal value based on scarcity is really useful if we're trying to figure out how to handle productions of televisions and cars and other things in a market economy. It has its limitations. But most things assume the more quantity you have, the lower price, lower value. Payments is different. The more people are on a network, the more valuable the whole network is. I love to ask the question, when Alexander Graham Bell built the phone, what was the value of one telephone? 0. Who are you going to call? Right? The more people on your payment system, the more people you can pay. Right? This is the economics driving the merger of Capital One and Discover. A different topical subject, right? A lot of places Discover is not taken, like Visa and You walk into a store and they go, oh, we don't take MasterCard. Really? I don't see that much. American Express, a little bit, not as much anymore. Discover, you're not 100%. You walk into the store, you see a couple Steins, right? But the idea of Capital One buys Discover and they move all of their cards onto that rail, well, that's a pretty big market not to take. And that creates so it's an agglomerative economy. And this is why getting a payment system like the Chinese system off the ground is so hard. Why should I join your system if there's no one else to pay? But if you can get, the more people you convince, then the more value proposition it is, and the more you can get it off the ground. Another reason why I think American policymakers have to actually start weighing the pros and cons about when to use payments as a policy lever, what rises to that threshold, and then clearly enunciate the framework, at least, by which we're looking at it to provide reassurance to other folks. And if by enunciating that framework we actually move more people to the other system, then it's a good moment, maybe we should reevaluate the framework. Because I believe we're assuming something is cost-free. We're assuming that every time I turn this payment dial against my enemy, I've done good against my enemy and I haven't thought about the broader system effects. And that worries me. It also worries me that we struggle when to turn the system the other way. When does Russia come back on? Are we going to ban online poker for forever? Through the banks? What other types of situations, right? And why that? Why online poker but not sports gaming? You end up with a system that makes no internal logical sense, right? Why is Russia treated differently than Cuba? What happened in Iran that they had a higher level of sanctions put on? Is it just a bill was up for renewal and somebody wanted to be tougher? So the core point that I'm making is we have a powerful lever in the payment system. America can use this for its own political purposes. Not necessarily a bad thing. No ideology here walking in saying payments is only about economic growth. Check your morality at the door. If you want to put in policy, ignore the payment system. I think that's a mistake. I think we have an opportunity to use a lever wisely and for good. But there's a temptation to use it sporadically in a way that could ultimately undermine the very power and authority that we have. So maybe I can take some questions. Yeah.
And I'm not sure how to frame this, so indulge me a little bit. But thank you. The Chinese economy is inflated. It's bloated, right? Like.
It's very large. Some people think it's at risk of a sharp slowdown or recession, but it's the second largest economy in the world.
Right. Well, so I'm wondering, where does that come into effect when we make these decisions too, right? Because we could say, oh, it's smoke and mirrors. They're not actually going to be able to do this because under the surface, there's nothing there because, but I don't know, because you kind of lay out a very interesting, like we've used it so much as this, like, look, we have all this power, but what we're really ignoring is the counterbalance to it. And so it's not actually a question. It's more of like, it's never been, I've never had that actually just laid out to me, but I do think that there's still that question of what do we know about the Chinese economy? And
so I'll say a few things. It's hard to know. When I went to China for the first time to look at, this was the idea that they could have a financial crisis due to problems with state government-owned banks, I realized why people don't go to China often for research. because when you talk to the Chinese people, you just get the same parroted lines. And then when I talk to people kind of more formally, they're like, oh yeah, we have a Hong Kong analyst. You got to go to Hong Kong and they'll give you the straight scoop. Now that was before Hong Kong got cracked down. If they keep this up, I may get banned by China next. They only give me a 1-year visa, by the way. I've asked for 10 years every time and they've dinged me. But even if their economy goes up or down, the size of the economy, right? Domestically, their payment system is light years in front of us. They all use essentially Alipay and WeChat Pay. Like they're all settling on Amazon and Facebook credits, is the way to think about it. China has 20 million credit card readers. I think there are 20 million credit card readers in this city. I mean, at a gas station, there are at least 20. The merchants refuse to pay the swipe fee. Chinese Amazon and Facebook set up these fantastic systems and their retail payment is awesome. Beggars on the street have QR codes. It's a totally nuts world. That being said, Switzerland is one of the largest payment operators in the world, right? Small economy. What do they have? Well, they have a pledge of neutrality. They're not going to steal your money, and they're going to shelter your anonymity more than almost any other country in terms of you don't want other people to know your assets and your this or that. So payments is a lot about trust, a lot about history, and which China is new to the game, and the trust issue is a real question. But you can have a big role in the payment system, not necessarily related to that. A lot of it is also about safety. So trivia question, and I know some students have heard this one before, so forgive me, but what building in the world has the most gold? Where's the most? You could go to one building and steal all their gold. Where's the most gold in the world? Number 2. When the Treasury Department, that's Treasury Department's gold. Fort Knox is number 2. Number 1?
New York Fed.
New York Federal Reserve. Every country has gold in there, including some on this list. Why? How did the gold end up in the New York Fed? Right? It wasn't Alexander Hamilton, although he would be very proud. That would have been his dream come true, right? It was in London. Do you know why they moved it from London to New York? The Nazis started bombing London. And if your gold was in London and it fell, then, gold is a bearer instrument. You can say, well, that's my gold bar. Well, I don't know what you're talking about. It's in my pocket now. And so, came to New York, safe. New York Fed doesn't take anyone's gold, even countries on this list that aren't liked. And so people trust that. Now there's a debate going on, a very real debate about whether or not Russia's frozen assets should be expropriated and given to Ukraine, most of which happen to be in Europe. Their custodial bank is in Europe. It's an interesting question, getting back to this core question about when do you use this power for lever. So I would say that, China has a lot of structural barriers to replace the US in their payment system. But unlike Europe, right, where you would say, well, you know what, if America's going to go after us, probably England will too, right? Historically, the US and UK haven't been that far apart on most major issues. China, on the other hand, who knows? So, do I think this SIPS thing is a major threat to us right now? No. But I think every time we turn this dial, we give China more leverage that it could be. And we need to think about that and be honest and weigh that in that comparison. Mm-hmm. A very good question, though, because it's the Potemkin nature. If China has shown that they haven't been honest with their economic statistics, that will reduce people's trust. Honesty is a big point, right? What's Winston Churchill's great line? You can always count on America to do the right thing after she's exhausted all other possibilities, right? We haven't stolen anybody's stuff.
Well, and I also don't think that, I think we would be silly not to even just look in the last 2 decades, right? China has been One Belt, One Road initiative, and people kind of ignored it. It's like, oh, it's happening. And then they started investing and funding both sides of wars. And then, but we really didn't do much about it. And then it wasn't until they tried to take over an entire country and the only airport out of, I think it was Uganda. Mm-hmm. And then they're like, whoa, we can't do that. And it's like, well, they've actually been laying these foundations and people haven't.
That's right.
So I feel like this is on many levels, and this is just the latest where if we are using it as a form of policy and a form of war tactics, if the second largest economy is saying, hey, we're also gonna play in this space, to not take it serious would
Huge
be
mistake.
delusional.
And the One Belt, One Road often did talk about getting your bank, your central bank, your payment system hooked up. That was part of the hooking up, so we can pay more efficiently. We don't have to go through this Western system. We don't have to settle in dollars.
My question was about,
Oh, I'll get you next. Sorry, I didn't see you. The blue light is coming.
just in terms of, trying to discern when we should be cutting countries off of these payment systems. Should the humanitarian aspect also come into play? Because I've heard people critique our foreign policy when it comes to economic sanctions as it hurting civilians and like their ability to access food and, and stuff like that. So should that also be a part of our, our process in figuring out appropriate responses with this type of sanctioning?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's hard to answer anything other than yes, but how much so, right? With regard to foreign policy, I try to know what I'm good at and what I'm bad at. And I try to just think in terms of economics and trade-offs, marginal value, marginal benefit, marginal cost, and then what value or price you put on those things. The market can determine that, policymakers can determine that. I don't want to impose my value structure. It gets very complicated. When I had to make a decision, was cutting Russia off SWIFT a good thing? Yes. I think America's view should be if a sovereign nation invades another sovereign nation without provocation, you're out. Now, easy to say, right? I think we would have done it with Kuwait and Iraq. What happened in the Falkland Islands War with the UK and Argentina? Was that provocation? Was that not? Like that. Would we really cut out one of those two countries off of our payment system? We've always assumed that it's not an ally of ours. So I don't know exactly at that meta level. And then the question becomes this or that in terms of, what do you mean by humanitarian? How much is suffering? How much you want to cause economic hardship on your adversary? But in this case with Russia, it was very clear to me what they did. But by the way, why didn't we do it when they took over Crimea? Right? Many people say, well, this is the second invasion of a sovereign part of Ukraine. They just took a little bit the first time.
Very interesting talk. America benefits great by the dollar being a reserve currency. If this keeps going on here, the dollars are going to flow back to America and have tremendous inflation. And do you think that's a real risk here? And people will accept that. 'Cause you're talking about cutting people off here. Things go, a loaf of bread goes to $10. That's a policy will not hold.
So there are a couple different things to unpack there, which I appreciate. The first is the dollar being the world reserve currency is an amazing asset of the United States. Not only does it give us all this political power in the payment, it's a huge benefit economically, right? The reason the European Union created a common currency was because the uncertainty of exchange between all their trading partners slowed down economic activity. I can't enter a 5-year contract with you exchanging Deutschmarks for French francs, and we don't know what their relative value is going to be over time. And so they're huge values. We don't have to worry about that. It's all priced in dollars. It's a huge benefit to us. And I do get worried that to the extent we keep turning this dial without thinking about it, it adds pressure, right? Life is also about alternatives. This is what I get into. If you're not going to use a dollar for settling trade, are you going to use the euro, or are you going to use the renminbi, or are you going to use Bitcoin? Like, what's the alternative? So while we're not there yet, I do get worried about that. As it relates to inflation, inflation is the change of price over time. If the dollar ceased to be the world reserve currency, then there would be more uncertainty about future values of the dollar, how much that would decrease the value of the dollar in global financial markets, and then reduce our purchasing power for imported goods, right? But also then make our exported goods cheaper. In the macro level, it gets kind of a little bit confusing. When you made the point about the price of oil, I will point out there's a high correlation between countries that produce a lot of oil and countries on these lists. I didn't include Venezuela, but I could have, right? Iran, Russia, Cuba's not one of them, but you can point that out. Now, America has become the world's largest producer of oil. The alternative energy beyond oil has been growing and continues to do so, but still, it's a very important metric in this space. The other thing I might want to point out there, and one of the ways in which us and Europe in particular have levered this, which I haven't talked about yet, is the role of other choke points. So to move oil, you need to put it in a ship. And that ship can't be any ship. You don't ship oil in containers, you ship it in tankers. Well, those tanker ships have insurance because accidents happen. And that insurance can be, is usually priced in dollars or euros. And that insurance company absolutely needs access to the payment system for all of what it's doing. And you can say, wait a second, you can't insure, if you insure any tanker that we see going there, right, we could death knell your business. And so as it relates to oil, one of the payment levers can be through other financial parts of the economy that may not seem like, well, I'll just trade oil. Russia's just going to trade oil straight to China, and China will pay them in renminbi and no dollars, no U.S. banks, just from China. Okay, well, how's oil going to get there? Oh, you're going to put it on a ship. Well, whose ship is it? Who insures the ship? And you can start to find elements in this where you can't fully escape the system as it exists today. Front row.
If we ever do get into, because we discussed the Belt and Road Initiative earlier, and if we ever get into like a tit for tat game as trying to like basically recruit companies or countries onto our system, are there ways to actually incentivize these countries to join us other than just raw, like this is how many people are on our platform? I know alternative like cryptocurrencies offer like lower gas fees, for example. So there's something with like conversion rates where we can do a similar thing?
So a couple different things there, right? Gas fees, for those of you who don't know, are the costs that people transacting in crypto pay back to the platform for the maintenance of the network. Sometimes they're also used to create an interest or payment for the holder of the currency or the validator of the blockchain for which it goes through. It's also kind of a little bit funny that crypto promised to have free and instant transactions, and you end up with paying a fee to get something put on the chain, which takes a little while. So there's for some of us who are, I would say, I started crypto agnostic, I'm now crypto skeptic. I think there's something kind of interesting about the gas fee. In order to get people to join our system, one, they're all on. It's actually more like under what rights do we kick people off? People want to be on because everybody's on. You have to take it. It's the value of that. So we've not yet had that problem. Instead what we found is people wanting to either do things that our system doesn't allow, so trying to find workarounds, or proactively kicking them off for these reasons. I do think we could do a much better job of moving the money faster and moving the money cheaper. If you've ever tried to transact between what's called the correspondent banking network, which is move money from your bank to another bank in another country, it can be a very low and very slow and expensive process. And there's no reason, it's built on a tech stack from the 60s. And there have been some attempts to modernize that. Most other countries have modernized their domestic payment system to be instant, and we have failed, and that's a whole other lecture. I could talk to you about the failure of the Federal Reserve to make our payment system faster and how that's harmed ordinary Americans to the tune of $100 billion over the last 10 years. But maybe that'll be the lecture next year.
My question is what do we lose economically when we make choices to cut an economy off? Is our economy so strong that we're insulated against potential losses from having completely cut off? Because it's not just a one-way cutoff, it's a cutoff. So that's my question, is what do we lose, if anything, from your perception?
So I think we lose a couple different things, right? So We lost online poker. Why isn't this going there? Right? I mean, people liked it.
Yeah, but I think what I mean more is like now we no longer have the circulation of money that would have been circulated if Russia had access, for example. So when you eliminate a particular geography's economy from accessing our system financially, does that impact our economy in any significant way, or are we too big
No,
of
it
an
does.
animal?
It does.
Like,
There were lots of American businesses that had exposure to Russia. There were people that lost money that had money in Russia. Russia correspondently froze accounts and did things like that. Absolutely. On the other hand, they were doing business. They were doing business with Putin. It's very hard for me to have sympathy. You know, you were going in there. You know, it's not as if this came out of nowhere. As I said, they invaded Crimea a few years before. That's kind of on you. But you do, right? And this gets back to the preeminent idea was payments are for economic growth. Run your policy separate. And just payments are for, and then people started saying, wait a second, hold on a second, I can use the payment system for this purpose. I don't like online poker. I use this payment system to attack this country. And they keep getting tougher. You can look at the history of, for example, Cuba sanctions or Iran sanctions. And every few years there's a new bill that's tougher, secondary sanctions. So first it was, you know, you couldn't bank with anybody in Iran. Then it was you couldn't bank with a company that did stuff in Iran. So one of the stories that I heard about that involved a German bank who banked for a German railcar manufacturer. And the railcar manufacturer had a long-term contract with the Tehran subway system. And they're like, we bank in Iran to help them run their metro in Tehran. That's it. We're not helping the military, whatever, you know. We're sending them axles for subway cars. And I signed a 10-year contract with them. And now I'm in year 6 and you just passed a new law. Like what happened? Like Iran's been Iran since the regime changed. Why now? And you know, is that right? Should we do? Should you know? Right? Look at Cuba. Right? Apparently they figured out how to keep their 1959 Chevys driving around for 60 years because we were cutting them off from new materials and new things like that, and they were figuring workarounds away that. So there are definite consequences to it when you cut off other countries and how hard you want to tighten that. Sometimes it's for good, sometimes it's for bad, but I think we have to think more critically about what those trade-offs are and who are, you know, what is the purpose of it.
Aaron, you spoke a little bit about the lack of standardization of when we pull this lever for policy. Kind of want to fast forward the timeline a little bit and ask the question about when we do try to move it back into the green. Are there examples of times that you think that that's been done well or correctly or none? And a follow-up on that, are there certain provisions if you were able to sort of author the U.S. policy on how we pull those things back, what that might look like?
I'm going to answer the second question because it's easier.
All right.
As I think about the first. Yeah, look, I think the first thing you have to do is get people in the room from different perspectives. From my time in the Treasury Department, the way the Treasury Department thinks is structurally different from the way the State Department thinks, as your comment about humanitarian and other roles, structurally different than how the Defense Department thinks. And what I find is either Congress acting or, you know, Treasury is doing Treasury is really the one that's has its finger closest to this in the sense that they're the ones with the payment system, they're the ones operating there. But there needs to be a coordination between the four to figure out what their metrics are, an analysis of how effective this is, analysis of the drawbacks, right? You may even include some intelligence agencies in this conversation who may have more intelligence that could show what the true progress is in the crypto space or in the China space. And so I think the one thing you would do is you would coordinate these folks to have it. The second thing I think you would probably try to do is do a little more empirical research, both on the effectiveness of it and also on the costs of it. And as it relates domestically, What I fear is there is absolutely no rhyme or reason as to which one of these 4 things on the list is getting hit. It's simply whoever had the political mojo at the time, and that there ought to be a bit more of a rethink about this. And I would point out, it isn't just government. I'm a public policy person, I'm a government person, but some of these pressures to get deplatformed off the payment system have come from non-government actors and from litigation. The idea that the payment system could be liable as having knowingly permitted transactions, and I think we need a little more clarity over that. And is that the way we want to go? So that's what I do there. In terms of turning the dial back, I don't have a good answer to that. Off the top of my head, if you said pick a country where you think you would go to look, and I'll probably do some analysis on this because that's a very good question, and my paper would benefit from having more of that. I would probably start with Colombia. So Colombia had some real problems in drug running and drug cartels, and they were on lots of lists, et cetera. I'd have to go back to history to see what they're saying. And now Colombia has really moved forward in that and has integrated itself much more into the global financial system, much stronger rule of law, some very good administrations. That would be one that would jump into my mind. I'd have to think a little bit about how some of the European countries post fall of the Soviet bloc, but I think that's where I'd start.
Are there examples of domestic policy where you've seen that, or are we sort of just at a stalemate?
Yes. So, I'll never forget this meeting because it made me laugh so hard. After the online poker stuff comes on, right, if you go back, the online poker stuff is 06, and I don't get into the Treasury Department till 09. And I want to say in like 2010, they were starting to do horse racing on online. They were moving to these online, and Churchill Downs comes in to my office, and they say we have a problem because some card companies are not processing transactions because they think we fall under this. And when you went back and dug up the history, which I was really excited, because I love horse racing, really excited to go into this, what permitted interstate gaming on horse racing came from because there's generally a prohibition on interstate gaming, right? Let's just start with the basics, right? Gaming can be done on the state level. There was some grandfathering, then the Supreme Court got rid of the law that grandfathered it. Gaming is really a state level. There's generally a prohibition on interstate gaming. I'm not quite sure how Powerball and Mega Millions get around that. I know I'm in one of the few states without a lottery, right? But horse racing was done in a 1970s appropriations bill by a powerful congressman from Kentucky. And if you understand federal law, appropriations bills are just supposed to be about money. They're not supposed to have policy on them, supposed to. There's a question about whether appropriations bills, because they're 1 year in funding, lapse. And the Justice Department had taken 2 internally conflicting opinions on the legality of interstate horse gaming, which is taken off. You go to a track anywhere and there are tote pools and it's a very national thing. So whatever the part of the Justice Department was that had said it was a 1 year thing hadn't bothered to enforce it. Just like with cannabis, right? Cannabis is federally illegal. You can be in a state, you can go to a store. It doesn't mean the FBI can't go in and say you violated federal law. And that the banks, some banks general counsels were reading this one way, and some banks' general counsels were reading this the other. And players were getting very frustrated, like, my card doesn't work, right? By the way, if you leave with one piece of useful information, your money is not on your Visa card. Your money is in the bank that issued the Visa card on the rail. Visa has never lent you $1. It has never moved $1. Visa flows the information. The payment processors and the banks flow the banks. Every one of your Visa cards is issued by a bank or a credit union, or maybe a debit card. You know, they're not issued by Visa. Amex is different. Amex is a bank. There's only one thing. It's closed loop system versus an open loop system. So it was nuts to me that you had a company publicly traded, like Churchill Downs, and that was having problems as a result of this legislation. And we actually had conflicting interpretations from the same Justice Department. Eventually it got resolved. I'm not entirely sure how they got it, because now all my cards work.
If you'll join me in thanking Aaron Klein for this talk tonight. Thank you so much. Before you leave, I also want to encourage you, if you are available, just 6 short days from tonight. Next week, we are hosting another Brookings Scholar Lecture Series here at UNLV. It'll take place Tuesday, March 26th at 6 p.m. here at Greenspun Hall. We will be welcoming Aaron's colleague, Lauren Bauer, to Brookings Mountain West for the first time. She'll be giving an interesting presentation on the ways that our nation's social safety net should work for working age adults. So if you can come out then, we would really appreciate it. We'd love to see you. Aaron will be around for a few more questions. Otherwise, everyone have a great night. Thanks so much.